Canada's 2025 election is not just about politics. It's about your mortgage, your equity, and how your real estate strategy moves forward. From buyers to landlords to developers, what each party plans to do could shift your next 5 to 10 years. What's up, everyone? My name is Jack Bouvier with the Bouvier Real Estate Group here at eXp Realty in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. If you're looking to either buy, sell, or invest in this dynamic, fast-moving, fast-paced market, I'd be more than happy to help navigate you in this market and achieve your real estate goals. If you have any questions whatsoever about what your house is worth, or helping you find a property potentially off market or one that fits your family needs, or looking to invest in this growing economy here in Saskatchewan, then feel free to reach out to me. My contact information is in the description below. I'd be more than happy to connect with you and help you achieve your real estate goals. All right, so we're in the middle of the election here in Canada, the federal election, and the two primary parties, the Conservatives and the Liberals, are leading the charge. We're going to be primarily focusing on these two groups for this video here. And first off, I want to forewarn everyone watching this video, I am not a very political overview guy. I have my own different opinions, but I'm going to keep this as unbiased as possible and just highlight the facts of what each party is saying that they are going to be doing if they do get elected into power, and how it's going to affect the Canadian and the Saskatchewan, and specifically the Saskatoon real estate market. So we'll dive in, and if you have any questions, please reach out. However, beginning here now, where it says in Canada now, we've been facing this housing crisis for decades, and now these two governing powers, the Liberals and the Conservatives, have a major undertaking, and they're proposing both two totally different solutions, both pledging to boost the housing supply and ease affordability, but through different philosophies. Public sector interventions and partnerships, free market incentives, and penalties are two different types of approaches that both the Conservatives and Liberals take. So let's dive into some more details here. So now for this housing supply challenge that we have here in Canada. There's a tremendous housing shortage, as the Canadian Mortgage Housing Corporation estimates an extra 3.5 million homes beyond current building space are needed by 2030 to restore the affordability. And right now in 2023, Canada has around $240,000 housing starts, which is less than 36% of the annual construction amount that's needed. So very, very low. And for the population growth, which is outpacing the construction, it's not a good supply and demand curve. In 2022 and 2024 alone, Canada's population grew by 3 million. Fewer than 750,000 new homes were started, leading to crowding and price escalation, as we can see here, especially in Saskatoon. And so this leads to the affordability crisis. Now, with the housing costs now consuming about 60% of the median household's income, up from 39% a decade ago, the national vacancy rate still hovers around at 2.2%. So vacancies are crazy low. Majority of people's income is going towards housing now. So how do they solve this? We can see here with the housing starts, it's certainly gone up since the time has gone on, and we can certainly tell that it's certainly not enough to compete with the amount of population that Canada is receiving and expecting. So on to what the Liberals' plan is for this housing crisis. They want to double home construction, which means that in Canada, they want the current rate of residential construction over the next decade to reach 500,000 homes per year, which is aiming for 5 million new homes in 10 years, which is quite a lot. They are wanting to take more of the government approach. They want to creating a federal housing development agency to build affordable homes at scale on public land and partner with private builders. So that's their approach. They want to be able to finance and prefab these investments, providing $10 billion in low-cost loans for affordable home builders and $25 billion in debt plus $1 billion in equity to catalyze a new industry of Canadian-made prefabricated homes. So it's all to their standard, what they think is best for our market, and that's their solution. And so this is going to be a development-free fee relief and approvals. They're going to cut municipal development charges by 50% for multi-unit projects and expand the Housing Accelerator Fund to streamline permitting and zoning. So that's the Liberal plan there. Now, as for the Conservative plan with Pierre Poilievre's approach, they want to build 2.3 million homes. So in the next 5 years, 2.3 million homes is roughly 460,000 annually, so not nearly as much. They want to fire the gatekeepers, which means that they require cities to increase housing by 15% annually, or they're just going to simply lose the funding. So they're certainly gearing towards more funding towards the housing developments and housing starts. And as for zoning, they are mandating high density zoning near transit, and they want to sell 15% of the federal buildings so they can essentially have the public sector and the housing companies to be able to develop on that land. And they also want faster permitting with 60-day approval deadlines with consequences for delays. So that's a summary of what the Conservatives' plan is going to be. Now, as for this expected impact on the housing supply, with the Liberals' approach, they are planning on bringing this direct investment from the federal leadership to ensure more affordable units do get built. And this is important for the smaller markets and underserved segments, but large-scale government projects could face delays and cost overruns. Now, in the longer term, 5 to 10 years, if the Liberal plans to truly achieve the 500,000 homes per year, it could significantly improve housing availability and affordability across Canada, a transformative amount that echoes post-World War II housing boom. So this would be a lot. Now, as for the Conservatives' impact, this would be more so placed in the profit motive and the local compliance using carrots and sticks to get out of the way of builders. So essentially, they're just putting in the hands of other developers, other housing corporations to develop for the economy that we need to. And so this could spur faster private development, especially in the high demand regions, but maybe not as much in the smaller markets. So in the shorter term of the 2026, Poilievre's policies might stimulate a quicker uptick in housing starts from coast to coast, and developers and investors will likely respond with swiftly to tax cuts and fewer hurdles. Now, how do the development incentives and regulations apply here? Well, with the the Liberals' approach, Carney's plan would be to cut through bureaucracy by modernizing regulations and actively supporting projects through collaborative incentives, which would be things such as the Housing Accelerator Fund, which gives grants to cities that commit to housing-enabled reforms. They're also planning on streamlining building codes and eliminating of the duplicate inspections. They're also planning on having the municipal fee buy down of 50% of development charges for multi-unit housing. And now, so for the Conservatives' approach for these incentives and regulations, they want to take a more forceful stance to remove the gatekeepers and empower builders directly. So they want that mandatory 15% annually housing growth targets for cities, or lose federal funding altogether. They want to preempting the local zoning bylaws and by regulating the high density building permits near the transit. So for Saskatoon, with the bus rapid transit system, all the development and neighborhoods that are close by are going to get much more incentives for having proximity to the rapid transit system to increase density. And they're also wanting to have performance-based management for federal housing agencies. So if it is a federal agency that wants to develop on the land, then they're going to be having those performance-based incentives in regards to that. And they're also going to be leveraging federal assets by selling 15% of the federal buildings for housing. So 15% is not a small amount. It's a good chunk of that federal buildings amount that they're going to be putting towards the housing. So they're actually showing that, hey, we're willing to sell off some of our assets to give back to our country. As for taxation and the GST on home purchases that we see here, currently 5% is the standard amount for new homes, federal sales tax. That adds a significant amount to the housing construction. What the Liberals are planning on doing is removing up to $25,000 by removing the first-time home buyers GST on home purchases up to $1 million. Now, as for the Conservatives, they want to axe the tax of GST totally up to $1.3 million on all home buyers. So that would be a $65,000 incentive by removing that GST on those new homes, which is a good chunk of money. Now, for capital gains and investment taxes, the Liberals are planning on incentivizing with the MURB program, which reinstates the 1970s era multiple unit residential building program, it stands for, which allows for investors to write off rental construction costs against their income. So it's a good program, certainly for investors. And for Conservatives, they're planning on doing the reinvestment tax cut. So this means that with the Canadian first reinvestment tax cut, it would allow any person or business selling off an asset to pay no capital gains if they reinvest the proceeds into Canada until 2026. So it's kind of like that 1031 exchange in the States. A little different approach, obviously some different rules and regulations around it, but that's the overall premise of the idea. Now, what we currently have with the primary residences, currently neither party will pay capital gains on the primary homes, maintaining long-standing principal principal residential exemptions. And also the Liberals are likely going to maintain anti-flipping taxes and underused housing tax on vacant foreign-owned properties, whereas the Conservatives have been relatively silent on these measures, so it's not totally clear as to what the Conservatives are planning on doing on more of the anti-flipping and the foreign-owned properties. Now, coming back to more of the income tax approach with the housing. Now, for the Conservatives, Pierre Poilievre's Axe the Tax includes pledges to reduce the overall tax burden, which could improve Canada's ability overall to afford more housing. So they are planning on cutting the carbon tax, which lowers your home heating costs. They want to also broaden the income tax relief, which allows you to take more money home. They want to remove the GST on home heating bills, and they also want to support the first-time home savers account. Now, for the Liberals, they're not proposing broad income tax cuts. However, they are focusing more on tax benefits on housing specific needs. So such as GST removal for first time buyers, investment incentives for housing, as well as maintaining current income tax rates, while also possibly targeting more measures for ultra luxury properties. So certainly more of niche targeting for those incentives on the taxes, where Conservatives are more of a broad approach. Now, looking into the rental market trends, we can see here that from 2022 to 2024, the vacancy rates have slightly increased, but they're still tremendously low. Rents were skyrocketed in 2023. They've come down a little bit last year, but overall, the Canada rental market is extremely tight, and we see that in late 2024, like I said, there was that relief. Saskatchewan's vacancy rates improved slightly, but still remaining only at 2% in Saskatoon and 2.7% in Regina. And so rents in Saskatoon rose by approximately 7-8% year over year, yet Saskatchewan still has the lowest rents in any province. So prices are quite low. Our rents are still low compared to Canadian averages. They are still very, very comparable, and I would say beneficial for the overall cash flow investment market for lots of investors in this market. So now, what are the Liberals' plans for the rentals? Well, like I said, they want to remove the GST on the rentals, where it's already in effect 5% cheaper for developers to build apartment buildings. They want to do this MURB tax incentive, which would resurrect program to spur tens of thousands of rental housing units. They also want to have direct affordable housing, where they build deeply affordable units supporting housing and shelters. So they want to try to help out the people, the lower income, for those affordable houses. And they also want to support the rents by having possible expansions of the Canadian housing benefits for low income renters as well. Now, the Conservatives' plan for rentals, they want to have private rental construction by removing GST up to $1.3 million homes and forcing cities to expedite the permits. Poilievre expects to have more market rate rentals to be built, and many of the 2.3 million homes in the past 5-year target that they're planning for would presumably be apartments and townhouses for rent. Now, encouraging the more small landlords, Poilievre often speaks about removing disincentives for the little guy investor. A Conservative government might explore tax changes such as allowing interest deduction for rental income or capital gains rollover when moving from one rental property to another. And they are also planning on reinvesting the capital gains too. So the reinvestment tax cut plays a role where it encourages investors to shift capital into new rental developments. For example, a real estate investment trust could sell an older building and build 2 new ones without any tax penalty. So that's a huge benefit as well. Now, what can we see on the mortgage accessibility and interest rate side? Well, in 2022 and 2023, the overnight rate climbed from 0.25 to 5%, causing massive deterioration in affordability, with ownership costs taking 62% of the average person's income. Now, in early 2025, inflation has been easing, and experts do anticipate the Bank of Canada will cut rates by mid-2025, where RBC does forecast a drop to approximately 2% policy rate. Right now, we're at a 3.25 upon recording of this video, and in 2025 late in 2026, either government with 5-year fixed mortgages rates could fall back into the 4 to 5% range, with approximately being much more accessible compared to that 6% that we experienced a couple of years ago. Now, for the Liberals, as to what they're planning on doing with the mortgage policies, as for the 30-year amortization, they want to make first-time home buyers amortize a mortgage over 30 years up to from 25 on all home purchases, lowering the monthly payments by 8% for young buyers. And now for higher insured mortgage limits, raising the cap for CMHC insured mortgages from 1 million to 1.5 million, which will allow for more buyers to purchase within 20% down or under 20% down in expensive markets. So that is also certainly a huge benefit. And now for the mortgage charter and easier switching, they're allowing insured borrowers to switch lenders at renewal without a stress test, increasing competition and potentially lowering the interest rates as well. So if your mortgage is coming up for renewal, you can transfer that mortgage to a different lender with no stress tests and more competition for that other lender to potentially beat the price. And the Bank of Canada is planning on, doing a little bit more independence per se, which will potentially help maintain the investor confidence and potentially also keeping the long-term rates lower. And what are the conservative mortgage policies that they're saying that they're going to be doing? Well, they want to keep sound money rhetoric. So they are promising to restore common sense economic policies so that inflation stays low, arguing that controlling inflation will naturally lead to a lower interest rate. They're also wanting to have more pressure on the Bank of Canada. While the Bank of Canada independence is formally supported, Poilievre would likely appoint an inflation hawkish governor, signaling prioritization of the 2% inflation target, which they're targeting. And for the mortgage rules, they're advocating for longer term mortgages, 5, 7 to 10 year fixed rates, and potentially extending 30-year amortizations to all buyers and not just first time home buyers. So this stress test adjustment might also direct regulators to recalibrate the B20 mortgage stress test if market conditions warrant, potentially increasing purchase power as well. Now, onto the immigration and demographic trends. The population has certainly surpassed the housing starts in the past recent years, which has caused a big increase in the overall price here in Canada, especially in Saskatoon, and simply just lots of people seeking rentals because there's nowhere else to live. So immigration has been a double-edged sword for Canada's housing market. The Liberal government has historically remained high immigration targets up to 500,000 new permanent residents by end of 2025, plus hundreds of thousands of international students and temporary workers annually. So this contribution to the record population growth of 1 million plus in 2022 and 1.3 in 2023, it still outstands for good economic vitality by still keeping all of this in hopefully more reasonable manners. As one analysis noted, Canada added 4.7 people for every new home built in 2022, which is far above the normal ratios. So shifting immigration policies as to what each party is planning on doing. The Liberals with Carney, they're planning to adjust the immigration levels until we expand the housing. They say that the Liberals under Carney is advocating immigration in balance with housing capacity. Practically, this means that the lower targets in the $350,000 to $400,000 range will stay in place for the next few years, where they have not yet fixed a date to resume higher levels. There's not a predetermined point when one would remove or adjust those caps. It's more or less tied to the housing progress. So they're just going to keep on monitoring the housing progress to keep in pace with the immigration. Now, what are the Conservatives more so positioning? Well, they're saying that Poilievre has a pretty radical immigration increase contribution to the housing crisis. He frames it as needing moderate, common sense immigration that grows housing and infrastructure faster than population. So the Conservative government would likely maintain something similar to the Liberals' revised targets, 400,000 or even slightly less annually, at least initially. Poilievre did say that the Liberals destroyed their immigration system and will get it back to moderate, reasonable levels, but they didn't really say what specific plan they're planning on doing on reducing that immigration to 400,000. Now, for the foreign investment and the investor confidence, well, with the foreign buyer measurements, the Liberal governments are implementing several measures to address foreign investment in residential real estate. There's going to be a 2-year ban on foreign buying of residential properties, and that 1% annual tax on vacant or underused properties owned by non-resident non-Canadians. They're also going to be enhancing anti-money laundering enforcement as well, so that does not get messed around here. So what are the Liberals planning on doing in the future? Well, they're expecting with Carney to maintain the housing that should not be treated as a speculative asset by foreigners. They're likely extending the foreign buyer ban or replacing it with a nuanced regime. They're also wanting to continue beneficial owner transparency and money laundering crackdown. And they're also planning on welcoming foreign investments into building housing, not speculating. Now, as for the Conservatives, what are they planning on doing? Well, rhetorically, they're been more so focusing on the domestic issues than blaming foreigners. They might ban the lapse if needed or deemed unnecessary to extend it. They're also potentially replacing the ban with tax on foreign purchases or reorientating the foreign interest towards productive investments. Now, what can we see on the investor confidence outlook? Well, for the Liberals, they're wanting to welcome more international markets, giving this global finance reputation. This steady hand approach would keep credit ratings agencies comfortable. Real estate investors might have mixed reactions since Carney's extensive housing plan involves a much bigger government role, which some private developers might not find too appealing and potentially more competitive. But he's providing lots of incentives with financing, which may be a beneficial utilization in the industry. Now, for the Conservatives, they're more of a pro-investment, unlock billions, build for change, lower tax type of approach. This is music to many investors, since if we do see an uptick in land development deals and proposals if Conservatives win, anticipating a friendlier environment internationally, some might be cautious about Poilievre's less predictable stances, but by 2025, he has mainstreamed considerably. So now, wrapping this all up, what does this outlook overall look for the Canadian and Saskatoon real estate market? Well, the 2025 election presents two distinct visions to fix Canada's housing crunch, and like I mentioned, this is more so on the Conservative and the Liberal approach, yet both recognize the core problems: not enough homes, not enough affordable rentals, and outdated policies. But platforms govern on some solutions: boost housing supply, cut GST on housing, and extending the mortgage amortizations as well, while also diverging on execution. So now, under this scenario, Canada's housing market in the short term of 2025 and 2026 will likely see a pickup in activity. Longer term, 2027 to 2030, the hope is that these election promises translate into structural improvement in the housing system, higher vacancy rates, a healthier house to price income ratio, and a more Canadians able to own or rent at a reasonable cost. So there's lots of promises, and who knows what exactly will be made with the specific parties, either Conservatives or Liberals. However, I know this was more of a rundown as to what each of these parties are more or less promising to make, but if there's any differences or questions or changes or things that you also think that they said would be beneficial to know about the Canadian and specifically the Saskatoon real estate market, then please send them in the comments. I'd be more than happy to help out. This is, like I mentioned, more of an unbiased approach to what's happening in the Canadian real estate market, and I'd be more than happy to chat with you, and I appreciate you staying to the end of this video. Thanks much. Take care.